Thanks, Karun. I hope everyone's been satisfactorily caffeinated. So actually, we're due to have lunch in only half an hour, so we can't. So we can't spend too long on these questions, but we're going to try and do two of them before lunch, and obviously the final three will be taking place tomorrow morning. So question 2, is there anything particularly Canadian or North American about Rubinoff's ideas and work? Jeffrey Rubinoff is a Canadian. His work is meant to be seen within the context of a very Canadian landscape. Can we therefore call it Canadian art in that way? Does Jeffrey share anything in common with other artists working in this remarkable environment? Or is it more useful to think of him as belonging to a North American school of art? Or really, should we abandon national identity altogether and think of him in a very different way? So these are some of the questions that maybe we can think about. I would ask that everyone speaks as close to the microphone as possible. I've been given instruction to ask for this. So does anyone want to say anything about this?
Jeff, would you like to? Do you have anything to say, or?
Well, I would like to think that the work in art history is international, obviously. I wouldn't touch this question with a 10-foot pole myself, other than to say that Seabreeze does have, and we do offer to our foreign guests, the chance to have a Caesar. Apparently, it's not a great winner. So I might have to rescind the idea of being a Canadian artist based on the rejection of the Caesar by the foreigners.
It should have been mentioned it's best to drink it in the morning. Actually, it's kind of a hair of the dog thing.
Jenny, do you have something to say about Caesars? Or art, even?
Could I ask a question? I've sort of waded into this. This is sort of minefield, really, right? The question of Canadian art. I deal a bit with the question of is there Canadian architecture? But I was wondering if maybe Maria could sort of open up this topic a bit.
You're right, it's a minefield. There are a couple of points I want to make, and I'll make them very briefly in order not to bore you. Most people find Canadian painting boring and Canadian sculpture boring. Non-Canadians. Jeffrey is, to my mind, a Canadian sculptor. Several things happen in Canada that we should take into consideration. Up until the Second World War, Canadian painting, and even before, was dominated by landscape painting. Some of you may have heard of the Group of Seven. This was a sort of nationalist thing, landscape painting. After the war, Canada very much turned its back on Britain and wanted to forge a closer relationship with the Americans. And how this happened in art was that, for example, there was a school of art called the Emma Lake School in northern Saskatchewan, which is in the prairies. And every summer they would meet. And from the late 50s on, people like Clement Greenberg came up, Barnett Newman. And out of the school, and this is to get back to Jeffrey, out of the school came someone called Robert Murray, who was then a painter but became a sculptor from Vancouver, and another man named Ron Bladen, also from Vancouver. Both of those artists then went to the States and made their careers in the States and lived in the States and subsequently died in the States. Now, when Jeffrey was studying in Oklahoma, Robert Murray came down and gave crits. So this is a kind of circular thing. This is just one little example to show you what was going on in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Canadian artists were going down to the States. Some of them stayed, some of them came back. Jeffrey was there for education, but came back. So and there are also local artists in London, Ontario, Walter Rediger and Ed Zelnick, who Jeffrey exhibited with. I found a photograph in Canadian Art from 1970, maybe your first exhibition in London, Ontario.
That's right, the co-op exhibition.
The co-op
I
exhibition.
forgot about that
and one of your works is even there. I mean, it's hardly recognizable, but it's
Oh.
quite interesting. So, you know, we have to be careful with influences. You know, you saw your first Caro exhibition in Toronto when you set up your studio in 1971. You know, we've got to go back to Barnett Newman's Broken Obelisk, you know, from 1963. So there are all of these influences, and many Canadian artists, you know, either before the war they would go to France if they're French Canadian, or to London. After the war, it was to the States. That doesn't make you an American artist. So international, yes, influences are international. They're not just... Anyway, other people will have something to say on this, so I will stop.
I had a quick question. Jeffrey, do you see yourself as North American or Canadian? I mean, there's something interesting about Hornby Island being on the very edge of Canada, and the nature of a lot of the people who came to Hornby Island in the 60s, 70s. It's sort of a rejection against North American, or American foreign policy implicit in that.
I have to say that I see art as not really having any borders. And I must admit, and I had this conversation, a little bit of this conversation with Francis. I was very unhappy when the Canada Council was set up in '67, and here was a chance that it had to create an international market for Canadians who, at the time, like Walt Redinger, Ed Zelnick, Bob Murray, Ronald Blayden, were equal to anything that anyone was doing in the world. And I felt that it was a terrible error that grew out of the creation of the Canada Council. Firstly, it was meant to be a political entity that preempted and co-opted radicalism in Quebec. And the radicalism in Quebec was about saving Quebec culture from North American culture. And so the best way to get rid of these radicals was to buy them off. And so I think part of it was already automatically political on that basis. The rest of it was fairy dust for the rest of Canada. And in that fairy dust for the rest of Canada, I really thought that the wisdom would have been put the money in bringing international artists to show Canadian artists with those international artists. That would have been the best spending of the money, because it would have shown Canadian artists with their ability to be international artists and to stand on their own internationally. Instead, it became what grew out of an imitation of the CIA in the 1950s. It became part of state-supported avant-gardism, which I just can't stand. I just find it, wherever it is, to be horrible, because what that does is, as the market commodifies art on a monetary value, so too this nationalism in art commodifies art as a political value. And I think that they're equally wrong, they're equally bad, and equally bad for art history. So I saw how that happened in Europe. I guess the first glimmer and dream of the European Union was around 1953 or so. And I think what grew up in England and all of Europe were these nationalist movements. Once you look to a common currency and a common government, the thing that you had to sell that with was preservation of culture. Exactly the same thing the Canada Council was doing in Quebec. And once you did that, you now had bureaucrats picking and choosing what art was, and the concept of freedom itself in terms of art was already owned by the politics and where the money in the politics was going to go. So that's the second area of commodification that I've rebelled against. So I don't care whether I called it Canadian or not, it makes no difference to me. I wanted to recover the idea that art belongs to humanity and not just to some type of nationalist political goal, which I think is really, really bad for art.
Yeah, just to add to that, Jeff, the Canada Council really started giving out money about 1959. But one thing that happened in Canada that we haven't addressed, it's not just the support of the Canada Council of electronic video stuff, this sort of work that, it's very interesting in itself and began in the 60s. It is the support, above all, of Native art, of Inuit sculpture, and of Northwest Coast First Nations art. And a lot of money from the Canada Council went into that. And also, that's what the public wanted. There was a sort of guilt thing there that, we treated the natives so badly, as we did. And the Inuit as well. And that art form, that sculptural art form of both First Nations and Inuit, I think took the place of the modernist sculpture, the kind of stuff that you were doing, that was coming up. I really do. I think if we hadn't had that movement, which of course exists to this day, I think the cultural landscape of the country would be quite different.
Yeah, this is it's interesting because I haven't read anything of an open debate of this at all. And after all these years, it really should happen. I don't know why I concentrate on 67, but there was something about 67 where the Canada Council really became funded. And of course it did after the FLQ started the mailbox bombings and other things like that. It became evident. And Viva Quebec Libre, that statement. And suddenly the Canada Council money was just flowing like a flood. And it worked. That's the really odd part, is it really worked.
Joan and then Jenny.
So is there an innate conflict then between being so local, so specific to this place, that is, Hornby Island in the Northwest, and the very particular light, the very particular sort of colors and colorations, and saying, well, it's all about the Canadian landscape, but it's not.
No, would we say that Florence is all about Florence? I don't think so. Florence happens to be incidental to the great international art of Florence and the statement that it says to humanity, but the rosy, glowy light is in those paintings, and then the argument has to be, well, could they have done it anywhere else? And I have no idea, but it doesn't really matter. It's not where it happens, it's what's the result of what happens. And so in looking at the result, that's what we have from Florence. And it's only incidental that this beautiful light happens to be there.
But it's the place that grows it. That's the soil from which it comes.
Yeah. And could it have happened anywhere else? It was a strange set of political circumstances that brought
Absolutely
it there.
true.
Yeah.
No, I was just sort of saying, well, it's a little bit of a dichotomy to say it's international.
I know, but
it's both international
from an
and
artist's
particular.
point of view, it's the result. It's a gift to humanity. It's not a restricted gift to humanity. Here, we're going to give this on a condition, and that's the problem that underlies this book, is not what they did or even the results, but the underlying motive of it, finally ending up having to be questioned, because the motive of it was not giving a gift to humanity, it was a political position. And so I don't see that with great art, and it doesn't matter, the great art that from this particular period, and there's some, I wouldn't say all of it, but there's some from the period of the abstract expressionists that is a gift to humanity, and it doesn't matter whether the CIA was behind it or not.
But so it's very easy, isn't it, to reread retrospectively the nature of art in the past, and to say that what Michelangelo was doing, for instance, in Florence was actually just about humanity, whereas Florence was one state among many states that were warring with other Italian states. what a lot of these artists were doing was very political. It was about the identity of the state. I mean, Michelangelo's David was a great symbol of Florentine national identity. We have, all the years later, now that those identities have dissolved into the past, can appropriate and can celebrate David as a universal symbol of humanity, whereas at the time it wasn't considered that, and it wasn't intended as that.
Yeah. I've tended, because of that, to consider myself an artist historian of art history, as opposed to a historian who would look at the facts at that point, but rather as an artist historian of art, to be able to judge the value of art now, and through. So if I can judge that art through the artist's eyes now, then that's the part that really seems to matter, because it's what can be passed to me from all of those generations of years that in turn can influence the work that I actually do. And so that takes all the rest of that stuff and sets it aside when you look at an artist's point of view of art history a little bit different. Doesn't neglect the facts. What it does is it say, what does it do for art at this present time? And does it have that gift to humanity that I'm seeking in art, both from it and doing it? So I don't deny anything that you're saying that way. I think that it's a different judgment. And the same thing goes with the Cold War issues. It's very much that way from an artist historian of art. It's what's alive and well in this, and what's dead and gone.
I think you make a very important point about the context, whether it's Canadian, Cold War, whatever, which is that it's the art can be viewed, and it's very useful in many ways to view it in the context or the circumstance in which it's produced, but it can't be reduced to those circumstances. And what you seem to be describing, articulating, both in words and in work, is the idea of some kind of almost like a song line, you know, a kind of codified chain of transmission, which stands outside of the official canon, the way in which art history is made. And I mean, I see that as a kind of very interesting plea for autonomy, a kind of healthy separation, if you like. But it will never be that sort of codification will never really be the only way of looking at art, because as we've said.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and that's not the only way that I look at
No.
it either. But I have learned to separate it and glean it from history itself. So, you know, when we look at this beautiful light of Florence in a say a Leonardo painting, the truth is that none of us could stomach Florence in those years. Their bodies were stacked like cordwood in the streets. The garbage ran in the gutters. The sewage ran in the gutters. The smell would have been just absolutely overwhelming to a modern person. So we don't see any of that. And we don't perceive any of that in that wonderful painting that has this beautiful golden glow, golden red glow. So it's separating the value of the art from all of the other political things that I'm talking about. But that's all that it's doing. If I listen to a great Bach piece, I don't think about what was going on politically at this particular point or whatever it is. I'm looking for the art within that particular thing. That's an artist approach to art, which is a little bit different. Doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It's just, from my point of view, is what can be passed to me as I feel in that coding. And that was what I've talked about, that there is a coding which I've perceived for originality, that the artists pass from each other, pass to each other. And it's quite independent even of a political stand that the artist takes or any other thing that they might have dedicated their lives to. Does that de Kooning work or doesn't that de Kooning work? You know, really is what it comes down to. Not is it an icon of de Koonings, but is it a working de Kooning? And there aren't that many great working de Koonings, but there are a few. And when you look at it from that point of view, then not every de Kooning is going to go up there and be valuable from an artist's point of view, but some are also invaluable. You can't put a commodity value.
There's one definition of great art, I can't remember who came up with it, which is great art is the art that makes artists think about what they can do next.
Well, yeah, that's
Where they can go next.
Essentially the way that I perceive it, yeah. It's a very living thing, too.
Jenny, you had something to say?
Question really, what of your perspective on the Cold War is informed by being Canadian?
Oh, fear, great fear. That's what I remember, from the 50s, is great fear, all the time. Especially in elementary school, we had a teacher who didn't bother having us dive under our desk because he said, that's ridiculous. If that thing hits, you're going to be incinerated in an instant. Maybe don't even bother doing it. And I remember the acute awareness of this, and our school was out in the country, and they still used these great sirens, these great air raid sirens, which were in the city, and they reached all the way out to us, and they would run those things during the day as tests, and every time a chill just went absolutely through me. So we were adjacent to it all, and in London, Ontario, we were in the belt. So when the Cuban Missile Crisis actually occurred,
Jeffrey,
we felt there was no chance of surviving.
British French know what you're talking about?
Jeffrey, can I interrupt there?
Sure.
Simply because these are important themes, I think, in your intellectual evolution, on which I hope to be touching tomorrow when we discuss your ideas in a broader context. And I make this comment now simply because I know James is well aware that we've got to give adequate time before our lunch to issues that will then focus us on David Smith and other.
Absolutely. So, I try to answer the questions as they come at me.
Yes, Heather.
The only question I'd have is, do you think being out here in the 70s gave you more strength to sort of have a frontier spirit and believe that you just were going to go your own path and not be so worried about what New York thought, or you'd made your decision, you get out here, and there's a lot of energy comes from being out here. Even though you're more individualized and isolated, you're still in an environment that encouraged your art or not? I don't know.
I love the weather out here, even though most people might hate it. And it was a lot rainier in those years, and it never bothered me. I can't answer the rest of your question because I would be interfering with what Peter is saying. It's a different level of consciousness, which were the voodoos and the genie missiles, which were nuclear tipped. And the only two places in Canada where there was nuclear weapons was in North Bay and Comox. So we knew we were on Dr. Strangelove's. We knew that we were on Dr. Strangelove's map, right? That there were planes focusing in on Little Hornby Island, and was very conscious of it.
Going back to the question, and then we'll move on to the next one and deal with that. Is I suppose I think that all academics should be beware of any essentialism and try and say that there is a Canadianness of art, or there is an Englishness of art, or a feminine kind of art. But I think that probably the reality is that unless you get that exhibition in MoMA and you agree to it, people will probably never see a Rubinoff sculpture outside of Canada. It's and maybe not just outside of Canada, but apart from the pieces that you've got a couple of pieces in London, Ontario, but they'll have to travel to this particular place in Canada to see them. So we can't completely exclude that geographical location from the experience of the sculpture.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, James, because you posed the question. I sort of had the thought that is there a difference between small C sort of geography Canadian art or Canadian artists and large C nationalist Canadian art? And I mean, Maria, maybe you have an opinion on this, but I was having a discussion that the idea of the landscape and nature being so much a part of Canadian identity, the sort of rugged isolationism, rugged individualism of the West. Aaron Rosen picked up on that in his title. I'm wondering, like, does that really influence the? Is it similar to the sort of air that you breathe? That's where the art generates out of. Is it enough of a category that needs to be attached to the work to understand it better, or is it just an incidental? Is it sort of like, well, yeah, it's made in a Canadian space?
I don't think Canadians have a copyright on the landscape. I was just in Scandinavia, and you look at the history of Scandinavian art, or even go to Munich and look at the artists there, the Blaureiter, Gabriel Munte, people like that, who were very much into the Bavarian landscape. So it's Canadians grasp at what they can get. Something that's usually different from the Americans, in that our landscape, it ends somewhere way up there.
Okay, well, maybe we should move on to the final question, seeing as lunch is rapidly progressing.
I've bought us a few more minutes with some insulating blankets. So we've got, we have about 18 minutes.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so let's move on to the final question of the day. How important is the sculpture of David Smith to understanding Rubinoff's development as an artist? Jeffrey, himself admits that he owes a huge amount to the American sculptor David Smith. Indeed, his Series 1 works, look very, very similar in many ways to those Cubite sculptures from the 1960s. What is the nature of that relationship between the two artists? Why did Rubinoff look to Smith other than other sculptors? What did he learn from him? And are there any other sculptors to whom we might, try and draw comparisons? So this isn't, I suppose, just a question about Smith alone. It's also a question about artistic influence and where artists jump off from. So we've obviously got Jeffrey, who knows a lot about David Smith, and we're very lucky to have Joan Packner, who knows as much about David Smith as anyone. So, Jeffrey, do you want to say anything first, or?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I talked about it yesterday. The David Smith in the UCLA Sculpture Garden is probably the strongest piece he ever did. And there were other very strong pieces in that sculpture garden, and I used that piece where I wanted to depart, when I wanted to actually reconnect with art history, because that piece in my mind was not only his best piece, but it's a piece that left all of his colleagues behind. I mean, by a great distance, and you could see that in that sculpture garden. And so that was one part of the departure. But there's another thing about David that works for me that is probably not easily foreseen, and that's knowing that he didn't have a market allowed him to move from series to series and experiment and work and close a series and work on another series. And he didn't have a dealer over his shoulder saying, I can't sell that. Don't give me that. Because he didn't have a market, or had a very, very small market, he had a certain freedom to be able to move on from series to series. And what makes, I think, my work unusual is it moves on series to series. And that's not, it's not an evident thing, because so many artists get branded from what they do that they just keep moving on to variations of what they had done in the past. And that's a subtle difference that I think I learned from David Smith, is that if you recognize that you're only going to have a very small market, you now have a tremendous amount of freedom in order to keep evolving. So that was all I want to say about that.
Joan, is there anything you want to say?
Well, I think, why don't we start with the question that I posed before, which was about the fields. what did he know and when did he know it? And yeah, that's
Okay. I've never been to Bolton's Landing, but I've said that my handbook for David Smith was written by David Smith himself. It's David Smith by David Smith, a book that was published in 1969, and I bought it at that time. An artist can look through a photograph and see what the other artist sees. I really believe that. I mean, if I didn't believe it, I really wouldn't be making art right now, because I think I see different things that Michelangelo saw, that Rodin saw, that Leonardo saw, different painters see, and they've taught me to see through their eyes as well. So that's when I saw the landscape. And a lot of it looks imperfect, and a lot of it looks the way my little field looked when I had overcrowded it. But I think I could see the way he was seeing those particular pieces. And since he photographed them himself as I photographed my own work, I really feel like I was looking through his eye at that particular work. And I wouldn't have paid to go to Bolton's Landing by 1969, 1970 anyway. The work had been spread all over the world by then, yeah.
Does anyone else have anything to say about this? And it doesn't only have to be about David Smith. It can be about the nature of influence and...
Well, I mean, I wanted to ask about the time that you took off from that series. That was 1981.
81 is when the piece was complete. It was
completed.
actually 1980 that I created the piece. It just was finished in 1980.
Was there a particular connection to, and I know you had gone through a period of not making art before that. Was this just
not making art in the traditional way of looking at the art world and the market itself as the base, as my world? And there were a number of other artists who did that. Michael Heiser went out into the desert and started creating this great cityscape out in the desert. And it was pathetic because it turned out to be right by Yucca Mountain. So luckily Yucca's been canceled, but he was about to have nuclear waste run right by his life's work. You know, that would have been just a very, very difficult thing. And then there's James Turrell out in the middle of the desert who's still working on the crater, and has dedicated his life to that. He's done a couple of other pieces, but the crater, I think, is probably his masterwork, and dedicated to these single pieces. Walter de Maria did Lightning Field, but I don't know what he's done recently.
So you were aware of these projects at the time that you...
Oh, yeah. And I decided that I would do a very different approach because of this connection to art history. I wanted to test art history rather than move on from it or reject it, because that's what they did. They became very reclusive, very singular, and I somehow or another wanted to test art history to see whether or not I had the ability to actually deal with it, because I had never really dealt with it before. It was always a thing to learn, use, and then reject. And that was just the way avant-gardism worked, when we really didn't have any right to do it, I don't think. We were too young to have that ability, because we were too young to actually understand the art history that we're actually rejecting. So it became rejected out of hand, and it became the commodity of the dealers. The commodity of the dealers was, don't bother. Sorry.
I just noticed that Barry is eagerly clutching his microphone, and then to Joan.
It's really a question for Joan. Not being a Smith expert, I'm interested in the relationship Smith had with his own sculpture park, in fact. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it wasn't a sculpture park. He lived at Bolton Landing, which was an 86-acre former farm that he had purchased with a shack, and they would go up. He bought it in the 30s, and they were going up every summer. So they'd live in Brooklyn, and they'd have a rented apartment. They would give up the rental. They'd pack everything in the car, and they'd go upstate to Bolton Landing. In 1940, they decided to move there permanently, and a couple of reasons. One was financial. It didn't cost much to live up there. Even though they didn't have any running water or electricity, they could, farm, and boy, Dorothy Dana was pretty intrepid and willing to go along with that, because those winters are brutal in the Adirondacks. There wasn't a lot of there. It was just a very difficult life, but I think it also, he came he had a very pioneering spirit from the West, and so he went up to Bolton. He starts putting work outside in the field first in the late 50s and more intensively in the 60s. Basically, he would do it because they were too big to hang out in the studio. He would sometimes gather them in groups before they would go for exhibitions. Later on, because in fact they didn't sell, he would put them on bases and just sort of populate the fields. He was living alone because, of course, wives couldn't live with him after short periods of time. And so that was like his lab.
Betty, aren't you amazing?
But fortunately, Jeff is not David Smith. And so it became like his laboratory. So, just like, Jeff says he moves from work to work, and we become conscious of the series. He photographed his work because there was no one else to photograph it. In the process of photographing it, he naturally became its primary interpreter.
And were people, obviously he'd receive visitors.
Yes, lots. He would have, Clement Greenberg would come, and Pollock would come, and Ellen Frankenthaler would come, and Motherwell, and Alexander Lieberman, and, they would eat and drink and do all the things we enjoy doing while we look and talk about art. And one thing I feel is very different about David Smith is that he did maintain his connections to the New York art world, that while he was isolated in many ways, he would talk at Bennington, which wasn't that far. Everything's far from here. He had a running correspondence with many friends in the city, and he would pop down for a show, to see a show, and that type of before highways was simply easier than it. You can't do that, and I think you've chosen not to do that, so that gives your endeavor a much different trajectory.
Joan, can I ask you a question? Sorry.
I just wanted to interject something there. I met the son of Leila Katz, who was a sculptor, I don't know if you know her name or not, from the 50s, from that period of time. And he said when he was a kid growing up, the artists would get together in a place like maybe Barnstable or something, wherever it was. And if somebody made a sale of a couple $100 of a painting, they all ate. He said that's what they did.
Yes, there was a lot of generosity.
This is the abstract expressionist school itself. So there was something about staying connected to New York that was a lively thing. It wasn't just a market thing. It was
that was a community.
Yeah, and it didn't really matter what the CIA was doing or what money they were putting up. That's an interesting story because it included people like Jackson Pollock. If he made a sale, everybody ate and drank. The other point, I guess, that I wanted to make is that I met Bob Murray in graduate school, and he talked about doing a pilgrimage almost to David Smith, visiting him up there. So he was a young artist, a really young Turk at that particular point. So it wasn't just the big names that you...
No, also even Kenneth Nolan,
like,
he was a kid.
Yeah. So I thought that was very interesting. Sorry, I was just interjecting.
Yes.
That's okay. The question I wanted to ask Joan was, Geoffrey obviously is very precise about his citing of the sculptures here, and once you put them in place, you rarely move them. Was David Smith similarly strict about his positioning of the sculptures?
No, he would move them around. He would sometimes he would stick them. It's really hard to imagine. He would just stick them in the back of his truck. They really weighed a lot, and he would put them in the back of his truck. Sometimes he would take them down to the town dock and arrange them, and people would watch. It would be like theater in Bolton Landing. It's like, oh, let's go watch this weird sculptor. He just works on the dock and take pictures. Okay, there's nothing better to do. And there's only one work that was considered permanent, in quotes. That was Tower of Winds, and that was down by the pond, actually, on the lower area of the property. But otherwise, no, things might come and go, and they would be moved around, and he would reconsider them, although moving them was huge effort. And some works were moved far less than others, or not moved at all. Like the larger planar works from the early 60s, like Primo Piano.
That reminds me when earlier I would keep the work all stashed in a smaller area so that they could be lifted and moved because of the wetness of the fields where you wouldn't get to them in winter, so that they were available for show. The shows that really never came. But they were available, and that was what was on my mind too. So I was probably on 5 or 6 acres too. Gradually, that just fills up, you know,
Right.
and you have no more space. You know.
Well, he actually put his in rows. So the siting of yours is, in general, it's much closer to, say, Storm King than it is to the fields.
But all of that's afterwards. I don't do that to 98 because as soon as I know I move them out of that 4 or 5, 6 acres, I know they're not going to be moved again. You know, especially when they lock in and say that's the site for them. But I knew that, and I purposefully didn't move them because it said goodbye to New York. You know, that was where I looked at it.
And then they became rooted here.
Yeah.
I think we have a question from Mark, or a statement from Mark.
I have a question in that, I mean, it's slightly terrifying to talk about the work of David Smith as such the world authority here. But to my sort of knowledge, you know, there's many David Smiths. His work evolved and changed a great deal. And it's interesting that, you know, you were so inspired by his 69 book, David Smith on David Smith. And I wonder, do you feel that there's that influence of that's the fixed point and that's what you've taken? Or were you very much actively trying to keep a dialogue going with how he was evolving, his successive work, what he was doing, who he was speaking with? Or was it very much
Well, he died in 65, so by 69.
But I mean, that sort of fixed that you weren't continuing with the dialogue of how he was being interpreted and how he was reevaluated. It was very much like, that's the David Smith.
Well, the problem was that there had never been a retrospective show, and finally there was one in 1983. I think it was 83, wasn't it? Or was it 82? On the 82 at the Hirshhorn, and Betty and I were in New York, you know, dealing with dealers, and we got on a U.S. airplane and got down to see this show. We went down specifically to see it and spent an afternoon with the work, and so there were several pieces that I got to see that I had never seen before. Some that were not in the book. Obviously, if he had sold a piece, he may not even have gotten it photographed. And also the book was limited. So, but I did see, I had been tracking around trying to find more of the Kubai series because they were flooded all over the world. I saw one at the Tate in 1981, I think. No, 82. Saw one at the Tate. But so my total collection of the Kubai series, which was about 20 pieces, I've actually seen them, was 4. And one that I really wanted to see was one that was at Dallas, and that one happened to have been in that show, which I was really happy with. So did I stay tracking it? Yeah, as much as I possibly could. Then I finally saw one at the Jerusalem Museum in 1993 that Billy Wilder did, and Aaron writes about that pilgrimage that wasn't the wall, it was the David Smith at the Jerusalem Museum. That was what really mattered.
Joan, can I ask one more question? How great or wide an influence did David Smith have on Geoffrey's generation? Were there a number of sculptors who were trying to pick up where David Smith left off?
It's an interesting, and it's an interesting question, because I actually have been thinking a fair amount about why in 1970 that Geoffrey decided to focus on David Smith and not more land art or conceptual art or scatter pieces or, you know, all the different directions that art was splintering into, and why he settled on David Smith. You know, you think about Marc de Souvre, well, who's very, very affected by David Smith, but not as many as you might think. David Smith's influence petered out right around the time that Geoffrey became focused on it, which is something that interests me.
Yeah. I was a painter.
At least that's my...
Yeah, I was a painter when I went to graduate school. And the graduate school was headed by a sculptor, and I was surrounded by sculptors, which I had never been around before. And so what I discovered, I had thought, you know, when I went to undergraduate school and discovered studio courses, which Canada didn't have, I've been raised left-handed and I'm really right-handed, and what a discovery that I'm actually am an artist and not, that this isn't just a hobby or something that I was born with, but it's actually something that's very real in history. And that was greatly liberating, and I was greatly liberated as a painter. But the truth was I was still being left-handed and right-handed because there was no sculpture there. And once I discovered sculpture, I discovered that. But my first pieces were in multimedia, okay? So they were laminated plywood and sometimes found objects and other things like that. And so those were my first sculptures. And some of them were really quite successful in and of themselves. But one night, I remember this so specifically, I started cutting steel, and it was at night. And the sparks and the life of this thing, this material just became absolutely alive to me underneath my hands. And I said, I'm home. I have finally come home. And it was all in that moment. It was revelatory to me. So my thing has always been steel and working on steel, and the touch of it, the feel of it, the smell of it, the sight of it, all of those processes of steel themselves have been just my lifeblood as an artist, is the way that I say it. And for David Smith, it was the same. So, yeah, so without
that... Yes, I
that,
agree with that. So it's really, I appreciate that story, which I had never heard before. And I also have another question. So it's sort of two parts. One, why the Cubi?
I felt that was the strongest move on his part to resolve the issues. If one accepted David Smith as a great three-dimensional painter, then we could have ended it there. But if David Smith would have had to accept it himself as a great three-dimensional painter, he was as irked, obviously, by the criticism of his work, which that had obviously flattened out, you know, in 2 dimensions, as I would expect him to be. So it isn't until the Cubi series that he really seriously goes to work that situation out. And of course, to me, that's my talent, you know, as you can see from my earlier work. Even though I was totally aware of David Smith and the steel, as an avant-gardist, I had to reject anything that he had done, because look at what I had done, you know. Oh, look at that, that's really original. So it was, it's understanding my coming back to David Smith is coming back to art history itself, to test art history itself for a creative run. And that was because the way that I saw it is that the art world that I wanted to be so much a part of in the 1960s was dead to me by the 1970s. So therefore, it had to be something that was far more internal. And to me, it was a test of art history. It could have been a total failure. If I hadn't crossed these lines, I would have gone on and stayed a successful capitalist, which was already in my hands. So, but once I grasped this third piece here and I had crossed this line, I was as lost as I was in the work as I was when I discovered steel itself. So, and as you can see, the creative run happened, so I have no argument with that. I did the right thing.
So Maria, Karun and Maria both have something to say.
My question is, after the first 3 pieces, did you ever go back to David Smith for any inspiration, or was there any further influence on some of the later series, or maybe in your thinking, some of his writings, or did it kind of stop?
Well, my goal was to get self-generating work, that work would grow past David Smith. From that route, be easily having it here to acknowledge it as, I now call these career breakers, because from an art world point of view, they were. But from a point of view of art making, as opposed to career breaking, they were critical as they moved step by step by step by step. So after the third piece, I knew I was on to something in that I was past David Smith, but not past him for what I owed him. I was past him for where he had gone. And we have to remember that he died at 59. So I'm 69. I've outlived him by 10 years. So we don't know what he might have done between 59 and 69. And how much he might have progressed in this particular direction. So we see this thing cut off at that point. He didn't go any farther. Half of, maybe even 2/3 of the work are not as strong as I would like to have been in resolving the question. Are they beautiful three-dimensional paintings? Still, they are, even though they're stainless steel. A few of them really do make it to the 360 degrees that he was looking at as goal, and the culmination in my mind is the piece that's in the UCLA Sculpture Garden. So when I look at him, I also have to look at him as an endpoint. And were he alive, and probably were he alive, I would have destroyed those first pieces. I would have just buried them or done something else with them, because they would have remained studies. As these are stepping stones into history from my point of view, and therefore were worth preserving.
Just very briefly, perhaps a question to both of you. We haven't mentioned the other Smith, Tony Smith, who gave a workshop when you were in Oklahoma, who looked at your work, who gave you a great deal of confidence, said, yes, you're going in the right direction. And Joan, are you familiar with Tony Smith's work?
Oh,
Yes, it was the subject of my dissertation.
Oh, well. Hey, that's perfect.
Okay.
Oh, that's perfect. The other Smith. I just didn't think we could
I'm a
close this
Smithologist, that's what they call me.
conversation.
The David Smith people, they were going to give me a package of Smith Brothers cough drops because I thought that was fun.
Sorry, what was the question again? What influence?
I just felt we couldn't close this session without mentioning Tony Smith.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited now.
Yeah. I would say that he had more influence on these pieces where there's tetrahedrons and other geometrics to it, and then especially the ones done in the shopping center where there are large carving, moving things within that geometric.
I saw that when I saw those shopping center pieces, it was like, ooh,
Whoa.
there he is.